So good morning, everyone. Let's get started. So the session today is going to focus on preparation time and case construction. So the point of this is essentially to help develop the strategies, methods, and understandings that will ultimately make the most use of the 15 minutes where the debate is won or lost. And people think that the way that they get better at debating is by attending a lot of tournaments or putting a lot of practice in, participating in a lot of debates. I actually don't think that's true. I think something that's far more important is doing a lot of prep times. And you know, if you spend 15 minutes preparing for a debate, you can, in 1 hour, go through 4 rounds and think about issues as much as a 4-round debate tournament, but you've done it in an hour. It's a very efficient way to use your time when it comes to improving. And the reason why I think that preparation time can be pretty much equivalent to practicing giving speeches a lot is that, particularly at this kind of intermediate level and moving forward, your speeches are not the moments in which you're coming up with new information. You shouldn't be coming up with a case while you're standing up giving your speech. Instead, your speech time, those 7 minutes that you're up there, is just when you're reading out what you've already prepared. And so the way you do better at debating isn't by practicing the speaking part, it's by giving yourself better preparation, and then just saying what's on your sheet of paper will naturally translate to better results. So preparation time and case construction, I think, is super, super important for not only doing well in a debate, but actually as a strategy to help improve yourself, especially because this is a form of development that you can do that doesn't require anybody else to be there. You don't need to have someone to debate against. You don't need to have a debate society host a tournament that you can attend. You can sit down and you can give yourself motions, you can look up random motions, assign yourself a random position, and then give yourself a preparation like you're in a debating tournament, 15 minutes, and then you can review that preparation and try to give yourself feedback, Do the 15 minutes like you would normally, and then afterwards work out what you struggled to come up with, look up that information, find out what you don't know, write it in, keep it with you. So that's why I think that this session is so important, and that's what we're going to focus on. Okay, so preparation time involves 15 minutes, right? And that 15 minutes of time is not very long at all. It's incredibly, incredibly short. But preparation time, or how you're preparing your debate, can carry over into the debate itself. Especially if you're the second speaker, you have 7 more minutes at least, or 14 more minutes to prepare whatever you're going to say. You have your partner's speech, and then you have the speech of the first person on the opposite team, and then you have your chance to speak. So those 15 minutes, I think, in most teams, should primarily emphasize the speech of the first speaker, because they are the person that has the least amount of time to prepare. So you should focus by and large on making sure that that speech is really solid, because if the second speaker needs a little bit more time to really work out what they're going to say, or a little bit more time to fill in some of the gaps and kind of flesh out their arguments, they have that, but the first speaker doesn't. So 15 minutes should focus on the first speaker. There are a lot of different strategies that people adopt when it comes to preparation time, and one of the things that I find really weird about debating actually is that people act as though there are hard and fast rules about how you should treat your prep time. So one of the things that I've seen people do a lot is they will sit in silence for a few minutes and think about it independently, and then they'll start communicating with their partner. So, and that's a strategy that works really well for some people, in which essentially you have 3 minutes of silent prep here, where the two people just think about the issue, write their own case. Then you have a period of time here where they discuss that case. and then maybe you have a couple of minutes of silent time at the end, where you are then taking on board the discussion that you've had with your partner, and then applying it back to the notes that you're making. That seems to be followed almost religiously by a lot of debaters, and I personally find it really, really useless, because I'm the sort of person who needs to, I need to say ideas out loud to realize when something I'm thinking is stupid. And if I'm just given 3 minutes to sit there and write something, I'll sit there and write something, kind of be unsure, feel like I can't talk about it because my partner is still writing, and then I'll eventually bring it up and be like, oh my god, that was so stupid, I don't know why I thought that was important. But then I've wasted a fifth of the time that I have allocated for preparation. And so, the preparation time strategy that you should follow will always, and kind of by necessity, it'll be something that you have to negotiate with your partner. And I was making a joke earlier about how this is a gift from my debate partner, Tim, but actually, one of the reasons that I think we have been successful is that we cultivated a really healthy working relationship that meant we were able to negotiate the strategies that worked well for both of us. So in our case, unless it's something that we both know well, we often will take a few minutes at the start just to establish the direction of our preparation, and then we will have the silent time in the middle, and then we'll come back and review it. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that there is no correct strategy, but the strategy that you should adopt needs to be one that is suited for your needs and that you're talking to your partner about, talking with your partner about, so that you are making use of prep time in the way that's most effective for you. So first of all, focus on the first speech. The second thing is divide labor. Okay, so people seem to be sometimes a bit hesitant to prepare material for each other, but at the end of the day, although you are going to be judged as an individual, you are first and foremost going to be judged on your performance as a team. And so, who says it does not make a difference to whether you're going to win or lose, as long as someone on your team says it. And so, dividing up labor means that you can focus on the person who is best at explaining a particular topic, write that material, but then you can share that information and reallocate it between the two speeches. So, again, going back to my own debate partnership, but this is something that I've done in debate partnerships all my life, is we'll be prepping something, and 15 minutes is never going to be enough time to really, really write something incredibly thoroughly and specifically from start to finish. It's supposed to be an impossible restraint, because otherwise, it would get a bit boring, actually. There would be no excitement to it. And so, there are so many times in which my debate partner, who is the person who tends to speak first, will be writing a case, and then they'll just say to me, can you just explain how this is going to affect the politics of the region? Or can you just explain how this changes the way that people see themselves in society, or whatever? And I will just write on a piece of paper, bullet point by bullet point, like line, 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 line. Essentially turn yourself into their assistant, and then hand it back to them. They then don't have to write it all out, they just read the material, and this is why people work on loose leaves of paper. They can just take that sheet of paper, put it in order wherever it makes sense within their case, and then they've got that material out. And this is the kind of thing that's only possible if, like I said at the very start of this class, your preparation time is just about preparing the material that you're going to read out, rather than anything else. Because if that is the case, then if you trust your partner, you don't even need to fully understand every single thing that they've written out for you. You can just read it out. And in this way, preparation time can be made more effective, because now, in that first speech, you're actually contributing 30 minutes worth of labor into the 7-minute speech instead of just 15 minutes worth of labor by having 2 people simultaneously work on the same speech. One of the things that people try to do a lot is they try to split up arguments. Don't do that. So what I mean by this is, suppose that you've got a debate and you come up with a principled point, a point about effectiveness and an impact. And then you come up with another argument about an impact in another area. Don't say, okay, so I'll talk about the first 2 in my speech and you can talk about the second 2 in your speech, and split up arguments between you. That's useless. Instead, what you should do is you should work on a coherent case between the 2 of you, and if all you're doing is focusing on the first person's speech, you actually are also benefiting the second person's speech by discussing it together. So that way, you firstly know for a fact that the 2 speeches will be intellectually coherent because they are essentially 2 halves of the same case. But secondly, what happens then is, even if you're dividing up the labor and you're starting to produce more dense speeches with more material, whatever's left over from the first person's speech can then just be handed back to the second person. So the way that this works is, the first person is being given 2 people's worth of preparation, and then they're obviously doing some of their own preparation. The second person is not getting that same attention during the preparation time itself. But in the debate, when that person then has to really finalize their own speech and get everything sorted, yeah, come in. They are also assisted by the first speaker passing material on to them. And the way that this works out is often them sitting down saying, I didn't get a chance to cover this material, and then handing them over whatever pages were left unsaid or left unfinished or that they think were unclear. And that can become the starting point for your second speech, but only if you're not trying to divide up the domains of your debate between 2 speakers. Because if you do that, then this material which is left over is not going to fit into your speech anywhere, and it's not going to be substantive enough to give its own category. Whereas if you're focusing on the same arguments in both speeches, what then happens is the second speech, kind of by necessity, just builds on and extends the first speech. And from the perspective of an adjudicator, at the end you look at the case presented by the team as a whole, and that's how you're judging which team should win or lose, and the case as a whole is one that is pretty compact and one that is pretty coherent. So don't split up those arguments between you. You should always be kind of sharing those arguments and sharing that preparation. Next, focus on winning. So during preparation time, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying something because you know it, as opposed to saying something because it's what's going to win you the debate. And actually this is a trap that's particularly common for people who have an expertise. So if, for example, you're a science student and you get a debate that's about, genetics or something, and you know a lot about genetics, you will have this desire to really show off your knowledge, but actually that's going to be to your detriment rather than to your benefit. And likewise, if you're an economics major and you get a debate about economic policy, it's so easy to spew off a lot of material that isn't necessarily going to focus on winning. So during your preparation time, I think the question you should constantly ask yourself is, what is going to win? And what I mean by this is, go into preparation time and try to imagine the adjudication. Hey, come and take your seat. Try to imagine the adjudication that's going to take place an hour and a half from now when the debate is done. In your imagination, what is the judge going to say was the reason that they gave a team the win? What is the most important issue in this debate going to become that is going to sway the judges, that's going to hinge on the debate? What is the most controversial issue that people are likely to disagree on, that if you're able to resolve that, you'll win the debate? And so that helps focus your preparation time between not just kind of having arguments for the sake of it, but focusing arguments that are useful. People also think that you need to have like 3 points in a speech. You super don't need to have 3 points in a speech. We tell people that as a training exercise when they're very new to debating, in order to help them try to think broadly about topics, in order to help them try to start developing structures to the speeches that they're giving, and to help them essentially develop logic that flows with some sense of coherency, that we can understand what's happening. But actually, if you spend your entire speech focusing on just one issue, but you're convinced that that is going to be the major issue in the debate, then that is sufficient for you to win the debate. And so the focus shouldn't be on how many things can I think of or how many points can I come up with. You shouldn't go into prep time with specific targets. I have to have 3 points. I have to have a principled point and a practical point. I have to have an impact on a vulnerable actor, and I have to have an impact on wider society. Those aren't true. Instead, you should ask yourself, what is likely to be the determinative factor in this question or in this topic? And focus on that during your prep time. This also goes through to the preparation that you have to do for a speech within a debate itself. So after the first partner has spoken, come on and take a seat. After the first partner has spoken, but before the second partner has spoken, in that intervening 7 minutes, one question that I always ask my partners to say is, what are we going to lose on? So, as well as what is going to win, imagining what the judge is going to say, this was the most important issue in the debate, and focusing our preparation time on that. I also, during the debate, when I'm preparing my second speech, ask my partners to divide up the labor. They do this thinking while I'm focusing on my speech, to think about what the strongest material from the opponent's side is that's currently beating our material, what the judge is going to decide we lost this debate for. And then they write down those points as maybe bullet points, and that then becomes the structure of the second speech. So instead of having to come up with lots of material from scratch, it then becomes, firstly, material that was left unfinished or needed extension. Secondly, it becomes the points that are currently losing the debate for us, and then what our response or our reasons for beating those arguments are. And so that minimizes a lot of the work that has to be done in the second speaker's speech, because it then stops being about creating a speech from scratch, and instead it starts being about situating your speech within the debate. So this is what I've been saying all week, and I'll continue saying it all week. The way you win debates isn't knowledge. It's not by being the smartest person in the room. It's by being the most strategic person in the room. Because all debating is about making trade-offs of arguments you could run but choose not to run, or things you spend your time saying as opposed to other things you could spend your time saying. And so the selection of those things, the prioritization of your arguments, the focus of your arguments is actually the thing that's going to win the debate for you, not how impressive your knowledge can be, not how, not what fancy theoretical words you can use in your speech. It's actually going to be about how you're targeting that information. So preparation time, which isn't just the 15 minutes before the debate begins, but is also the time just before your speech within the debate, essentially, I think, should boil down to these priorities. Focus on the first speech first. Once that is fully set, you will have naturally provided for you the information that should be in the second. Divide the labor up. So during the first 15 minutes, the second speaker should be dedicating a lot of their energies towards the first speech. After the first speech has been given, the first speaker should be dedicating a lot of their energies towards the second speech. Don't split those arguments. Keep the same threads running through. And actually, if you're dividing up labor and you're doing work for each other, almost by necessity, your two speeches will converge in terms of what you're arguing and how you're arguing it. And prioritize your information. Focus on winning. Focus on winning when you're selecting which arguments to prepare in the first place. Focus on winning during the debate itself by working out what the strongest arguments from your opponent are, so that the second speaker can use their prep time to target that information. The difference between the first prep time and the second prep time is the first prep time you have no knowledge of what your opponents are going to say. But the second prep time, just before your speech within the debate itself, you now have an understanding of what your opponents are going to say. And so you can prepare better. You can adjust your strategy as a result of this new information that you've acquired. And you should do that. Okay, so it's all well and good for me to stand up here and say, this is how you should prep. But what should you prep? That brings us to case construction. Okay, so what is a burden? Something that you have to prove. Good. Okay. So that's a start. Something that you have to prove. But something that you have to prove is actually only half of what a burden is. Because if you just think a burden is something that you have to prove, then you end up taking on burdens or misjudging which burdens you need to take on that are unnecessary. So it's not just something that you have to prove, it's something that you have to prove, or the bare minimum you have to prove for a claim to be true. Okay? This is the principal rule of debating. When you walk into every single debate, you should be looking at the debate almost like a logic puzzle. And you should be working out what the bare minimum you need to achieve to fulfill your side of the logic puzzle is, and that is your burden. So you don't have to take on burdens that are unnecessary, but you also shouldn't shirk burdens that you think are difficult. And working out which burdens you need to take on and which ones you don't need to take on are actually this. It's the bare minimum. Okay? Because if you don't do the bare minimum, then you are not going to win. And if you do more than the bare minimum, then you'll win, but you'll make it harder for yourself than you need to, because you're adding additional challenges to what is necessary. So actually, the burdens you should be striving for is the bare minimum amount of difficulty, the bare minimum amount of sacrifice necessary for a claim to be true. And the way that this ends up playing out is essentially like necessary or sufficient conditions. So I'm an economist, and so maybe it's my natural tendency to see debating as just a clever form of algebra, but if you were presented with an algebraic proof, and it was something like, okay, so show that y equals 72, right? We've all seen these in high school math exams, something like this. Well, what you do in that algebraic sense is, you take axioms. So these are facts that we just always hold to be true. So an axiom, for example, would be 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? That is something that we know to be true. And then we take theorems, which is the logic. So, for example, it'll be something like 2 times x equals x plus x, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a theorem. And then we take assumptions, and we say, okay, so if x is this number, then 2x is x plus x is this other number, right? So if x equals 3, 2x equals x plus x equals 3 plus 3, 2x equals 6, right? That is how math works. This is just math, okay? Like, didn't think you'd get this today, did you? But the point is, if we take this away, then debating is exactly the same. And like, one of the things that really stuck with me was something that my high school teacher said, which was essentially that algebra is just a form of notation. It's just a script that we use to write logic and that we're using to write ideas. Debating is just a language that we use to do the same thing. So in that sense, algebra and debating are equivalent. The only difference is, in algebra, we use numbers and symbols, and in debating, we use phrases and words, but we're still communicating ideas. We still start with things that are just uncontroversially true. We start with theorems that are generalizations that can be made about things. We then make a few assumptions that are reasonable or that we might want to test. And then we combine them to arrive at a proof, to show that something that is possible but not certain is certain. By combining things that are certain and known and theories that are generalizable, we take something that is unknown but demonstrated as certain. And so when you're in debating and you're taking on burdens, the same toolboxes apply for case construction. Now, necessary is the bare minimum that you have to do. So this is the same as your burden. Sufficient is indirectly proving your burden. Okay? So sufficient claims are claims that within the context of your case might not explicitly prove that the thing is true in all circumstances, but if it is true, it must also be true that your burden is being met, right? So, in the case of debating, this is the trap most people fall into, is they think, okay, I need to prove that this ends racism or whatever. And then their opponents will say, yeah, but the problem with your case is racism still exists. Haha, got you. Well, the trap that they're falling into is confusing a necessary burden and a sufficient burden. If you end all racism, then by necessity, you have also reduced racism. So ending racism altogether is sufficient to meet your burden of reducing racism. But you can reduce racism and meet your burden without having to end all racism. Does that make sense? So this trap of thinking you have to do things just because, thinking that you've responded to an idea because it is not sufficient is not actually meaningful response, right? You need to focus on things that are necessarily true or necessarily untrue and whether or not they meet that burden. So the axioms that we use, these are basically just facts, right? These are just facts that we have about the world. Theorems are logic. And then assumptions, this is your characterizations. At the start of your prep time, you will have these things. You will have assumptions that you're needing to make, and those are the characterizations about what is true. So, this house believes that as Bernie Sanders, we should run for president in 2020. Well, none of us actually know what is in Bernie Sanders' head. We don't know what his interests are, what his value systems are, etc. But we can make some assumptions based on his behavior. We can characterize what sorts of things he might care about based on what he's previously done. We do know that Bernie Sanders is a figure that came very close to winning the Democratic nomination, that he's a popular politician, that he's relatively old, that he's very left-wing compared to other politicians. Those are the facts. And then the logic in between is how we combine the axioms and the facts to meet our claim, which is that Bernie should. Okay? And the easiest way for you to know what your burden is going to be is to look at the wording of the motion. So if the wording of the motion is, this house would da-da-da-da-da, the claim that you're trying to show is true is this house would. And if you're in opposition, it's this house wouldn't. Okay? So then the next step of this is, when should we do things? When should we not do things?
And how?
What do you mean?
And how do these things?
Oh, well, yeah, but that's actually not part of your burden, right? So your burden isn't to say this house would do it in a particular way. It's this house would do it or this house would not do it. And demonstrating that there is a particular way in which you can do it is necessary. You need to show that it is possible, but not actually the burden itself. So it's more about what is the criteria for making this decision. Okay? There's a branch of mathematics, it's called decision mathematics, and it's used a lot in computing, like when computers have to work out how to do things. Everything they do boils down to a series of yes-no decisions, and that's what we call binary, and there's just billions of them, and that's how computers make very complex computations, is by a series of yes-no decisions. But all of those yes-no decisions basically go, if yes, then do this, if no, then do this, right? And that's what your debating has to be. So this house would, it's when should we do things? When should we not do things? Well, okay, we should do things if they lead to more benefit than harm. So, if more benefit than harm, do this. If more harm than benefit, don't do this. Okay, so when does something cause more benefit than harm? If more people achieve the benefit than face the harm, then there's more benefit. If a greater number of people are harmed, then it achieves more harm. Or you can say, if they are benefiting to a greater extent than what they're having to sacrifice, there's more benefit than harm. And so you can boil down your burden into a set of questions, a set of yes-no questions pretty much. And then eventually, you will find that you arrive back at your axioms. So eventually, this question of should Bernie Sanders run for president? Well, okay, this house would, as Bernie Sanders, is if it's in Bernie Sanders' interest. So what is in Bernie Sanders' interest? Well, the thing that aligns with his goals. Okay, so if this aligns with his goals, we should do it. How will we know if something aligns with his goals? If it contributes towards the achievement of that. How will we know if something is contributing towards the achievement of those goals? If it is effective in actually achieving the change he intends to. So if him choosing to run for president actually makes it more likely that his policies get enacted into the United States. So how will we know if that makes it more likely? Well, if him running is going to lead to him winning. How do we know that he's going to win? Because he's an incredibly popular figure in the United States. And so we've come to an axiom at the end, which is uncontroversial. And those series of yes-no decisions, we start by asking them as a bunch of questions, but then, if you flip that upside down in your preparation, it becomes your analysis. So we ask those yes-no questions, flip it upside down, and now we have that analysis, and that analysis becomes, Bernie Sanders is an incredibly popular politician in the United States of America. If he were to run for president, it is likely that he would come pretty close to winning it, or at least shape the national conversation. This means that it is more likely that his policies are going to be discussed in the political sphere than if he didn't run, and therefore are more likely to be enacted. Since Bernie Sanders cares about getting those policies into the public sphere and enacted into policy, him running for president makes those goals a reality. Therefore, as Bernie Sanders, we would run for president. Do you see? So the question that I started with, which is, what is my burden? Should I do this or not? The bare minimum I need to prove for this to happen. You keep going down and ask yourself, like, the decision question, when is this true? When is this true? When is this true? You eventually arrive at something that is uncontroversial. You flip it upside down, and now you have analysis that step by step takes you from something uncontroversial to an unknown thing that you are now proving to be certain. And the same applies for principles debates. So people think that with principles debates, they have to start with the principle first, and then turn that principle into the argument that justifies their side. It's actually the other way around. So like, start with the argument that you're trying to justify. Like, okay, so that we should, a debate that I did recently is that we should, it should be legitimate for a state to go to war to secure energy interests. And I was like, okay, so when is something legitimate? Well, something is legitimate if it is morally permissible. When are things morally permissible? If they are within the rights that individuals or states ought to have. Okay, well, when are things within the rights that states ought to have? When they align with the reason state exists at all, which is to protect people. Well, when is the state protecting people? When it's making sure that somebody is not harmed by factors outside of their control. Okay, well, when does that happen in this debate? When people don't have access to energy and they're facing harm. Flip it upside down. When people don't have access to energy, they face a huge amount of harm to their own well-being. Since the state exists to protect people, an extension of that is the state using its force to secure energy supplies for individuals. This is the reason that the state exists, and so it is a legitimate use of force, even if it causes harm to other people. Therefore, this action is morally permissible, and it is legitimate for a state to go to war to secure energy interests. Right? So like, start with your criteria for success. Start with your burden, keep going down, and then when you flip it upside down, you will have neat, orderly, logical, step-by-step case construction. And then you'll get there. But the final thing is characterizations. So one of the things that happens a lot is you will go through this level of logic and you'll start kind of explaining things, but then you'll find yourself saying, well, okay, this is only going to be true if people really are going to vote for Bernie Sanders. And this is only going to be true if Bernie Sanders really does care about his policies as opposed to just his ego or something. Those are the assumptions that you have to make to be able to move forward with your criteria, right? With your logic of questions. Note those down, keep them to one side. Once you've done this, you should have a list of all of the assumptions that you need to make for your logic to stand. Then focus on demonstrating why those assumptions are reasonable assumptions to make. And in any field of science, no one cares that scientists make assumptions as long as those assumptions are reasonable ones to make, you know? So we can make a reasonable assumption in an economics model that a life expectancy would be something like 75 years. Not because every individual person's life expectancy is exactly 75 years, but because that isn't an unreasonable assumption to make about the life expectancy someone might have. And so write down all of the assumptions that you're having to make. That is the characterization that you need to do at the start of your debate. You don't need to define every single word in the debate. You don't need to explain what you're going to stand behind. The only things you need to provide definitions for, mechanisms for, are the things that you have to have in your assumptions. And so when I was asked the question at the start, you have to demonstrate how it works. Only if it is only under certain ways of doing it that you can achieve your outcome, right? So you don't have to explain a mechanism for a tax increase because tax increases work the same. You don't need to talk so much about the exact specific number of increase in tax, right? You don't need to say it's going to be exactly 23% more tax in a debate. But you do need to say, look, we're going to assume that this tax increase is moderate, but not so extravagant that it completely removes anybody else's income. That's the bare minimum level of assumption that you have to make for the rest of your claims to be true. And that's as much characterization as you need to be doing. So what this then does is, it provides, in reverse order, what should be in your speech. Because you can then start with the characterizations that are true about the world, and then you can start with axiomatic facts, use the logic to explain how it causes each new decision, and then explain why the claim is true. That you should. That I do believe this. That I will do this. That I prefer this to that. All of those claims. And so that is how case construction in general should work for each individual argument or argumentative string. So then the final part of case construction is the evaluation or comparison of this to the alternative. So while this is a way of demonstrating that your claim is true, you're also going to demonstrate that your opponent's claim is untrue, right? So in this sense, what we basically mean is, as well as demonstrating why you are correct, because your opponent is also going to demonstrate why they are correct, you should preemptively try to work out why your opponent is incorrect and put that in your case. So your proof becomes stronger. And the way that you do this is essentially by trying to prepare the other side, I guess, of the debate, thinking about the arguments that are going to come out. And in the same way that you're constantly thinking about what's going to win this debate for you, think about if you were on the other side, what would win the debate for them? And then you can already start focusing your response. One way in which people implement this is often, it's known as pre-buttal, which is when they pre-rebut something. And that's not particularly useful because you might end up wasting a lot of time responding to an argument that your opponent is not going to make. So instead, take those things that are part of the opponent's case that you can characterize away and put them in your characterization. And essentially just, hey, come on in. Essentially just point out the facts that are different or the assumptions that are different that you're making about people's interests, about how people behave, about how the world is, and so on, that mean that it cannot lead to that conclusion. Because if the case that the opponent is going to make is reliant upon assumptions, you don't have to disprove every step of that case preemptively. You just have to explain why those assumptions are not true, and then their case cannot follow, even if they spend a lot of time analyzing it. Or at the very least, they have to explain why their assumptions are true, and that's a lot of work. So just make sure that if you are going to try to do any preemptive rebuttal, you're not spending a lot of time potentially wasting finite minutes in responding to a point that might not come up. Instead, work out what the underlying assumptions of those arguments must be, and only respond to those underlying assumptions, or at least explain why they're untrue and your assumptions are true, and then you will have a case that is quite rigorous against that. So, so ultimately, that is the kind of opposite side of your burden, which is not just that your claim is true, but also why your opponent's claim cannot be true. And therefore, we should prioritize your side versus your opponent's side. Okay, so then the final thing I want to say here is, you then take all of this and you dress it up later with the information that you have. So one thing that I always do, especially in debates about international relations or very specific contexts, is I try to think of it as though I know nothing about it at all, and I'm thinking about a generic country doing a generic action, and then I apply the information that I have on top. People sometimes get really freaked out when they see a debate about a country they don't know anything about, or they hear about a politician that they don't really know that much information on. Actually, all debates are very generic and general debates, and if you write the analysis first in a generic way, you will actually find that you probably have a lot more going for you than you think. So the first debate I ever did was that the Army of the Democratic Republic of Congo should incorporate rebel militias into the military. And I was 18, I walked into this debating tournament, I had no idea what was happening to me, and I was like, I don't know anything about Congo, what? And so I sat down and I was like, well, okay, the motion has provided me with this much information. there is a country with a military, and there are rebels, so I presume there's been a war, and it's the Democratic Republic of Congo, so I can reasonably guess that the war is somewhat recent after the end of colonialism. So tensions must still be ongoing because it's a recent war. Okay, so if there was a random country, Nishlandia, and in Nishlandia there had recently been a war, and there were two groups that were very tense with one another, and one of those groups was a rebel and the other group was the military, then if the rebels were incorporated into the military, that could help to ease tensions because now the people in Nishlandia that are part of the rebel group would be less likely to view the military as being the other ethnic group's attempt to suppress them, and instead they would feel more like Nishlandia was a state for everybody. Okay, great. And then you take that, and then you just like insert the knowledge that you do have, right? And then all of a sudden you've got your case. The reason that I'm telling you this for case construction is that if you don't do this, you will end up taking for granted certain claims and arguments because you'll assume everyone knows it, or you'll get freaked out and you will think that you don't have the capacity to put a case together, but you always do. And this way, you know for certain that you're going to prove your logic step by step because you don't know anything about Nishlandia, you don't know for certain that the rebels are going to join the military and make everything happy or not. You have to explain why that's the case in your made-up country or your made-up politician's life, and then you put the context back on, you kind of put the clothes back on the skeleton, and all of a sudden it seems like you know what you're talking about. And even if you're wrong, at the very least you're justifying your arguments, and what you're presenting is a reasonable or plausible claim for what might be true. So the final thing I want to say about case construction is always try to work on things in the most generalized level, and that goes not only for like the logic of how you're meeting your burden, but also for like facts about the circumstances or the situation, because that's what ultimately is going to win or lose a debate for you is, do you have the underlying logic clearly spelled out step by step? And so if you go into cases with that in mind, then I think it's far more likely that you will not only use your prep time effectively to get there, but also that you will achieve a more robust set of arguments. Finally, all of this stuff is a lot to remember, and I know that I found it really useful to literally like write it on a piece of paper and keep it with me, and to look at each word in the motion, work out what that word is trying to tell me about this situation, and what clues I can give myself to use as axioms in my like algebraic puzzle. But also, keep your notes with you, because with enough time and experience, this way of thinking and what you need to do and how to identify your burdens will become more instinctive, and you will be able to do it without needing to think very consciously. But the way that you help yourself get there is by keeping the notes of everything that you've written, because the first time round, you have to think of something from scratch, right? The first time round, I had to sit down and be like, what would happen if in a country the military incorporated rebels, right? Every debate since then, which has involved any form of military-rebel interaction or integration, I haven't had to think about it from scratch, I've just had to remember it. And keeping notes that are useful to you is a great way of starting to build a case file, actually, because you can keep all that information you've prepared, and then in the future, you can draw from it instead of having to come up with the arguments from the beginning all over again. And that's exactly kind of going back to what I was talking about in preparation time, which is your time is so finite that everything that I told you here is about making use of that time efficiently and achieving the most for the least amount of input. Keeping all of your notes and using that as the basis for future preparations over the years will allow you to do even more with even less input, because you already have those arguments written out for you. And maybe you need to change them up for the debate slightly. Maybe you need to take off the Congo dressing and you need to put on the dressing of Myanmar and talk about like the incorporation of the Rohingyas into the Burmese army. But the underlying logic is going to be the same. And it's going to be the same if you're thinking about it as a set of criteria for when you should or should not undertake an action in this category. And so constructing cases in this way is useful not just for the debate that you're about to sit and take place in, it's also useful for future debates that are taking place in that sphere, because you've now boiled a debate down to its essence. In ancient Greek times, Plato talked about things having Platonic ideals, which was the kind of formal, non-existent or imaginary perfect version or fundamental version of an object, you know? There was like a Platonic ideal of an apple. Every individual apple looked different, but there was some form that all these apples were trying to imitate. Logic, argumentation, debating is exactly the same. After a few years, you'll realize that every debate you're ever participating in is a different combination of other debates you've sat in before, but just placed in a new context that makes it seem like an all-new idea. Starting to peel that back and looking at the kind of fundamental essence of argumentation means that when you're coming to preparation time, you're able to approach those debates pretty instantaneously because you already know what you need to be achieving. And then your prep time is just about putting the clothes back on the skeleton and working out what about this particular context can you use as an axiom to justify your claim. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the session. I hope that was really useful. I think you guys have a workshop now, so best of luck with that. Before we finish, does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, feel free to come find me in the next 5 or 10 minutes if you have something that you want to ask about individually. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming.